this question really perplexed me. I don't think about what does wealth mean very often, and the first things I wrote down was family, community, wellness. And I think that ties into a lot of what you're saying when you think about the intergenerational, historical and intergenerational trauma that our communities have withstood. That wealth to me means that, but that does connect back to actual physical money wealth, because you can't be healthy if you don't have the resources for good nutrition and good medical care, and you can't be well if you don't have a strong education. We know there's horrible educational disparities, but every disparity and every data point that's out there, the Native people are either at the very bottom of it or off the chart altogether. And it was intended to be so through the whole concept of conquest and colonization, to create these systems and structures that we weren't really intended to be part of. And so we were asked to be the lowest of the low on the workforce, and not to have home ownership, and to not be engaged in economic, I guess the words are upward mobility. The intent of the conquest is to keep indigenous people at the absolute bottom if we can't get rid of you altogether. And so when I think of wealth, I think of the opposite of that, is how do we deconstruct that historical and intergenerational trauma? How do we create equitable pathways so that people can have home ownership, good education, good health care, and overall wellness? And part of that is financial wellness, because that's part of the picture.
Yeah. And what's fascinating to me is someone who's an historian that's looked very deliberately at the evolution of this state and this nation. If I could take you back to 1910, Providence, 74% of the population was foreign born, largely led by Western European immigration. In fact, the years leading up to and immediately after the Civil War, you see a massive Irish and German Jewish, and then from the north, French Canadians. And if I could take you to a neighborhood, say Upper South Providence, Lower South Providence, that was largely Irish and Jewish. That's why you see remnants of temples and St. Michael's Church on Prairie Avenue and such. And as those families who largely arrived here, escaping poverty and persecution in Europe, arrived here for economic stability and wealth generation, which they achieved through the mills, within several generations they were owning homes, owning businesses, and building wealth. And they would move up and out of South Providence. And the Jewish community would plant itself in its synagogues in the east side. The Irish community would go into Cranston and such. But the point is, they had mobility. And the difference today is that we're now approaching similar numbers of foreign-born. But now versus Western Europe, it's West Africa and the West Indies. In fact, there are more Afro-Caribbeans than African-Americans in Rhode Island. There are close to more African-born than African-Americans. So it's important to recognize that we've always been in cycles of immigration, and it's those immigrants who have came here with their entrepreneur spirit, their innovation, their opportunities, and they built wealth for themselves, and they built wealth for our cities and states and our country. And now,
so I had a very clear tripart identity in my home. I was Puerto Rican, I was New Yorican, and I was Taino. And it was very clear the distinction between those identities. And so, I have wealth. I grew up with wealth in terms of love. I never grew up poor, feeling like we didn't have food, even though we were poor. Somehow, my grandmother always had a big pot of rice and beans on the stove. You never went hungry. But I knew that, we had no professionals in our home, in our family. We had, blue-collar workers. Nobody knew what it was to have access. I didn't have access to a computer until I was in college. And so, I knew what wealth was, and I knew I didn't have it in a very traditional sense as I experienced it, as I navigated the world.
When I think about wealth, and this is the question that Jessica has posed to us, obviously there are very capacious ways to think about wealth in terms of the kind of resources of family, of community, of history, the kinds of things that we can think of as the assets that allow us to envision a different kind of future, and to define asset much more broadly than simply as a set of securities or a quantum of money. But at the end of the day, as someone who spends his time thinking about the economic past, I do start with wealth as money that makes money. And I want to think about ways in which opportunity and access to money that makes money has been organized unequally for a very long time and is baked into the structures of Rhode Island.